what kind of person is this that's saying they've had 3 decades of working in this industry and it's amazing and they love that work? What kind of person is that? Well, it's those jobs where you have rescue people's jobs, where you have saved the business. We need to speak more about the good work that the profession does. That will have a positive impact in itself.
Tim Cooper, I've known you for more decades than I care to remember. For those people who don't know you, maybe a quick introduction, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's good to speak to you, Andrew. And yeah, we've known each other a while. I've been working in insolvency and recovery for decades. I'm Tim Cooper. I'm a partner in a law firm called Adelshaw Goddard, based in Edinburgh. I've been around the country quite a bit. You and I know each other from our time when I was in Manchester and Leeds before that. So I'm a Yorkshire lad, moved up to Scotland, been here for about 13 years, and currently the president of R3, Trade Association for Insolvency. So it's wound me up here. That's me.
Okay, congratulations on that appointment, Tim. So for the layman, what is R3? What does it stand for? What's its objectives?
Well, R3 literally stands for Rescue, Recovery and Renewal. What it does is it acts as the trade association, a trade body representing the UK's insolvency and restructuring profession. Not quite, but almost 100% of licensed insolvency practitioners in the UK are members of R3. So it is a very representative body, but it is that different. We can be more partisan, more voice of profession, but we have to have regard to sort of wider interests. And we do, as a trade association, look to promote standards in the profession as well. So, but we have that distinction of not being mandatory. We're voluntary, but we've got a very good membership.
I've seen one of your quotes following the recent insolvency statistics, and you talk about the increase in CVLs, and you said it could be down to directors coming to the year end, or because after 4 tough years they've just had enough, which is a kind of really important point. So just your thoughts on the concept of the podcast and why you thought it's important for yourself and R3 to take part.
Yeah, well, I was really keen when you first approached me about getting involved in it, because it is massively important topic. It's something that I've certainly experienced throughout my career. When you get involved in financial distress, there's a lot more to it than that. Going behind the scenes of that financial distress, there's always a human story, whether it's the business managers, whether it's an individual that's running sole trading, or just a sort of consumer getting themselves into financial hot water, and the impact it has on people around them. It's not just the money.
Never measured on compassion and our ability and how we communicate with directors and after sales care, if you like, in terms of the impact it's had on them. So do you think insolvency practitioners do have a role in providing that empathy and compassion when dealing with directors and business owners in a professional capacity?
It's a difficult one for insolvency practitioners, professionals, because we're not medical health professionals, we're not mental health professionals. There are professionals that can provide guidance. It's cliched, it's trite. Problem shared is a problem halved, and professionals can help with things that business owners, managers, people going through it don't really understand or have not been used to, and that in itself has a positive impact. R3 has published and made available to not just members but to directors, individuals. We have guides for individuals, guides for creditors, because creditors are going through those same issues. And as well as for directors. So there's a guide, for example, on dealing with business distress, and within that are various sort of links and signposts towards those professionals and organisations that you can talk to and that you can deal with.
Yeah, and I think, and it's good. It's good that it's high on the agenda. And I've seen, having worked in consumer debt market and business debt market, there appears in more established policies on dealing with vulnerable clients that have consumer debt than directors that have got multi-million-pound PGs. Perhaps the expectation is, well, you run a business, can I guess you're a little bit more resilient, you know what you're doing. And I think it's really unfair. And I think some of the language that maybe even HMRC use in their demands just completely sucks the oxygen and out of any business. You haven't got room to think. It's paralyzing to some degree, and I guess then people might make rash and illogical decisions. Not that I'm understating the difficult HMRC in terms of recovering arrears, but I just kind of wonder whether they could think a little bit about the effect that sort of language has on people. Is that something that R3, if it does recognise that, might be able to lobby and have a conversation with HMRC just to maybe to rethink
that? R3 does have regular meetings with HMRC. We have regular meetings with the Insolvency Service and senior leaders of the Insolvency Service. So I don't think it's just a HMRC. Actually, I think it's sort of wider.
Yeah.
But there is no doubt that this subject is on everybody's agenda, and particularly in government-related organisations. So there is scope, but we also have to bear in mind that, particularly for the taxman, there are certain legal things that they have to put in correspondence when they're seeking and making demand for payment that has to be included in order to be able to address it. But yeah, R3 is there to put points out that the profession want to raise to those that it's engaged with on behalf of the profession. So I've got professionals such as yourself saying to me as R3 president, do you think HMRC could look at the tone of its correspondence because of the impact that it has on directors in a distress situation? Well, that's my job, my role to say, yeah, okay, we can take that up and see what HMRC says. So if nothing else comes of it, there's one action point that this discussion can have.
Thank you. Hopefully there'll be some more, Tim. But that I do appreciate that, and appreciate after 1 month that it's high on your agenda as well, personally. Just going back to a couple of points you mentioned then, really important. And this isn't about a free pass for directors to think they can exploit the insolvency regime and rack up arrears without any implications. But earlier intervention will always result in a more positive outcome if maybe through R3, but the insolvency practitioner is seen as is more approachable and more concerned with rescue and support rather than picking up the pieces, then that's better for everybody.
I couldn't agree more. I think as in virtually every press release for R3 that I've ever signed off on, there is a constant mantra of the better outcomes are achieved by the earliest intervention. And yeah, I agree that there has long been a perception issue about insolvency practitioners. I mean, even the name is fair, can create sort of fear. It's insolvency. But insolvency practitioners do an awful lot more than just the formal insolvency, as you say. It's interesting. I've just come back from an international conference for insolvency practitioners. It sounds very glamorous, but come back from that as so many jurisdictions talking about this, about that early intervention and adapting their regimes in different countries to promote early rescue and restructuring solutions for businesses of all size. And because it has tended to be sort of focused on large business, but businesses of all size. And there was one thing that I was caught by countries in Latin America that they were saying, sort of asked the question of those countries that have experienced going through a change in their systems where there was perceived to be blockers to being able to get an effective restructuring solution. And that might be regulatory constraints on lenders, because you might need to get some rescue funding in place. So what's the availability of that? Or it could be the insolvency regulation and regimes themselves. They're not as conducive to rescue. And in those instances where certain Latin American countries have gone through addressing those barriers to create more rescue culture regimes, that they said they found an immediate economic uptick in investment, greater availability of rescue finance and liquidity, and the use of rehabilitative regimes to recover businesses rather than to see them close. So they could have a direct correlation between those two things. So where does that all take me? And back to your question, it's yes, early intervention, and there is economic evidence across the world that early intervention in a regulatory system, an insolvency system, and a banking system that encourages that is of value to and positive effect on the economy. And it has to be a positive effect on the mental health and the feeling that everybody's got.
Yeah, and you've touched on a lot there, Tim. And I think everyone's pretty looking for the perfect insolvency and recovery tool. And we often talk about rehabilitation and renewal and rescue, but that's generally the business and the assets rather than the individual. So I wonder whether we ought to speak more to people that have gone through this, good, bad, indifferent, learn from it. What would they do differently? But also, how have they managed to start again? And can they share the experience? Because if you're listening to somebody who's gone through it, it's more credible and more authentic than any professional that has worked on the other side. So I wonder whether our profession and R3 might want to showcase some people that have gone through this and say, look, I'm okay. I feel horrible for the people that I've let down, but it takes some of that unknown away, and perhaps that might increase the appetite for early intervention.
Yeah, I think there is a case for that. At the annual conference that we had for the UK in St Andrews, we did exactly that. We finished off the whole conference with a special situation. We have something called special situations faculty, which is a group of practitioners, but it also engages with private equity, like Dragon's Den investors, if you like, and lenders, and a CEO. So we had that whole sort of group of everybody that works, as well as that business owner, that we're talking about and showcasing their experience and what makes good and bad successes. It's you mentioned something earlier. You said aftercare, and it's what happens after that process that is equally as important as what happens before. And that was one of the things that the CEO said. It's like, don't just think the job's done when we've got through that initial transaction. It's that support and continuity to make sure that the business that comes out of it the other side is a success.
Do you think enough analysis is done by our profession on the causes of failure, decision making, the commercial competence of directors? I know there's disqualification. We throw the Companies Act and Insolvency Act at directors, who some of whom have probably never heard or read it before they've set up in business. And I kind of wonder whether, I guess, in terms of rehabilitation, we look at those learnings properly, not just put them in terms of a data set for statistics. Look at them properly and think, what could have been different?
You can say generally that every business has probably got its own case-specific reasons for failure, and it's not one particular thing. It can be a aggregation of lots of different reasons that go to it. If we focus on one particular area, which is, you might call it competence or lack of competence. I prefer to call it sort of a skills or knowledge shortfall, because I don't think anyone, if someone is described externally as incompetent, well, that's probably because they've not had the right education for that particular skill set. Look, it's really easy to become a director. You can fill out some forms online, pay a small fee, open a company, sign up as director with no. So when I'm talking about education, I'm not just sort of thinking school education. No, I'm thinking there's no requirement to have any qualification to be a director. There's no requirement to go through any skills training. There's an abundance of material about what directors' duties and responsibilities, but there's nothing there. There's nothing to say you have to do any of that. But the standards that the law applies will then say, if you fail in those standards, you're incompetent.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good points there, Tim. I do agree. You literally don't need any qualifications to be a director. And then you think, well, yes, there's abundance of training out there. Whether people have got the inclination or time, I'm not so sure, but they haven't got the need to do it. I've spoken to at least 3 universities, business schools, and insolvency isn't on the agenda. It's business management and startup. In terms of what's invoice financing, what's liquidation, not interested. It's not on the agenda. It's so important. And kind of opening bank accounts, it's a bit like finance education at school, budgeting. It's just, for some reason, it's not on the curriculum. So I think there's a broader piece there. But in terms of, and I might I've slightly kind of misphrased the point I was making before, but there is a significant obligation for insolvency practitioners, every insolvency, apart from compulsory liquidation, when the official receiver picks this up, you're looking at the comments of the directors, and you're questioning about the circumstances leading to insolvency. Automatically puts them on a back foot, because they're thinking, well, you're doing this because you want to sue me, or I might be facing disqualification. So in terms of cause of failure, it might be a slightly kind of guarded response. So you're generally looking at everything that went wrong and nothing that went right. So I'm just wondering whether perhaps it's not a huge undertaking, but there's already a significant amount of work for disqualification act responses. So I guess as whether we'll just rethink some of the question of the directors.
You have to have that. Questions have to be asked of directors. And I don't think that there is an easy alternative to asking difficult questions that might be quite challenging. And in fact, in the UK, we have a system that there is no rule against self-incrimination in the answers that you have to give within this context. And there's, like I said, there are important reasons for that. The courts don't judge any of this with the benefit of hindsight. Maybe some of the questions might be judging things or implying there's judgment with the benefit of hindsight. But nobody's conduct is really going to be judged with hindsight. It has to be judged with what was the circumstances at the time. So I think when things go wrong, for whatever reason, those responsible for the management of that business will face some difficult questions, and there's no getting around it. And the best advice I can give anyone is to have an audit trail at the time, not to have to rely on the benefit of hindsight, but to be recording. And this is even in sort of owner, single director or sole trader businesses, is always keep a note of the decisions that you're making, why you're making those decisions. Keep notes, even if it's a day book. I keep a day book by me, and then nobody can look with the benefit of hindsight. That you can say, right, well, that's why it can be very difficult. Someone asks a question, and it relates to something that happened 2 years ago. To think, why did I do that again? And you just go back to your notes. Well, I did that on that time, and I was having discussion with that creditor, or just thinking about what direction we were going, and we made a decision, and that's what made it. And I did that decision, and it doesn't have to be right, because ultimately, whatever decision you take will be the right one at the time. But things may happen beyond your control and doesn't turn out in the way that you intend. I've got nothing to hide here. I didn't do this with intent. I've done my best, and here's my answer.
And I can't think of another profession where you might look someone in the eyes and say, I'm going to try my best to save your business and your livelihood. However, I might also sue you. You could end up bankrupt and you could lose your home. And it's extremely difficult to retain that objectivity, because you mentioned before, after sales, some directors would rather leave the country than meet an insolvency practice, the same insolvency practitioner again. Some of a more positive experience. And I think that's a real challenge and balance for us, because we need those case studies, the kind of that resilience and bouncing back and success to remove the stigma, shame, and lack of engagement. So what can our yours and Alfie's thoughts on how we can strike that right balance?
The evidence is out there across the globe that economies and jurisdictions that have a positive rescue, recovery, renewal approach to insolvency and to corporate distress and business distress and individual financial distress, that have a regime which is allows for recovery and doesn't treat the business distress or failure of a company. And I make a distinction between company failure and the failure of the business, because a company itself as a legal entity can fail, but that business can survive. It might not do, but it can. And we have procedures for where businesses can't survive and individuals can, need a bankruptcy. And as to look at sort of bankruptcy as it might not necessarily be a bad thing. It has the perception of being that. Liquidation might not necessarily be a bad thing. It may be necessary. It may be the right solution. But it's to have that complete range of solutions and overall a system and a culture that does not look at financial distress from the prism or the viewpoint of you cannot have business failure. That it is socially unacceptable. It has to be, try and avoid it if you can, but accept it when you can't, and have a positive culture towards it. And economies that have that, and jurisdictions that have that, have a better standing on the world stage, are more attractive as a place to do business, and attract greater investment, greater opportunity for liquidity for rescue finance, and deliver a healthier economy, which is good for everybody. Yeah, without exception, everybody, every single member of society benefits from that. So that's the kind of messaging that we need out there, and that's where R3 stands for. And I've been at this international conference hearing from lots of jurisdictions saying the same thing and banging the drum about how good the UK is, because that is the culture that we have.
But you look at the statistics and the language used, maybe headlines in terms of hundreds of thousands of companies that, at a stage where they're beyond the point of no return, they're hanging on, catastrophic failure. I think it's just that lack of understanding in the kind of general public that, again, will probably paint our profession and those statistics in only a negative light.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, one thing in terms of the perception of the profession within that statistical context is that insolvency practitioners don't cause 500,000 corporate liquidations. Yeah, insolvency practitioners are not the cause. We deal with and assist and try to alleviate financial distress and deal with the consequences where that's unsuccessful in terms of liquidations. So I think the general public at large need to look at statistics thinking this isn't the insolvency profession. There is one period in recent history where we can look to a much lower number of corporate insolvencies and look at that, and that not being a healthy thing at the time, or was healthy at the time, but then has to be consequences that have to be dealt with, and that's COVID. So going into COVID, an existential crisis economically, and you go in without government intervention, there would have been quite frightening statistics. If there'd been no government intervention at all, there would have been a catastrophic event upon the economy. If you have in an economy an area of business that isn't viable, that should really be closed down, you have a false economy, because you have businesses that are maybe operating without necessarily paying debts, extending credit, compared to a business that is viable, but is perhaps better run, or has got a better proposition, but is unable to compete with those businesses that are in financial difficulty because one is paying their debts. Putting it in simple terms, it's a lot more complicated than this. One's paying their debts, the other one's not. One is paying the revenue and the other's not paying the taxman, and just abusing the sort of taxman, or using that as capital, working capital. That good business is finding it harder to be competitive because of businesses that really have avoided going through a process that should be going through a process. Once you get into an environment where you have less of that government intervention to prevent any business failing, whether it's good or bad, through that, then you get this false economy. We're past COVID restrictions, we're past that government intervention to prevent an external event that's nobody's fault from having large-scale business failures across the board. Undoubtedly results in some businesses that shouldn't be protected getting protected, because you can't single them out, you can't make that judgment call. We're now out of that environment, and we have seen post-COVID a spike in corporate liquidations for that very reason. They've been protected, they were never viable, or they needed to go through a process and have gone. And that brings us back to a true economic condition that is much healthier for the economy. So that's where you have to put the context of all of these statistics.
I've been an insolvency practitioner for a number of years, and it's not always plain sailing. There's always difficulty running your own business as well, other than the demands of the profession. You've been around the business the same amount of time, and we've seen firms of insolvency practitioners, lawyers, and accountants have gone into distress. So, do you think that a H3 may already be doing this, ought to be considering support and counselling for its own members' mental health? And can you share any initiatives that are due to be announced?
Short answer is yes. We should, and we do, because you only have to think. There's some really sad cases that are so sad. They're extreme, very difficult to sort of talk about. But experienced and clients of mine have experienced the very worst of circumstances, and you're talking about individuals or directors or executives that take the worst personal circumstance and take their own lives. And you look at cases like that, but you also look at sort of more regular sort of circumstances of just seeing the potentially awful human impact that we started off with. And that itself can have an enormous impact on the mental health, anxiety, and all sorts of other sort of stress-related illnesses for the insolvency practitioner, and for their teams and individuals working with that. And it's how do you build that resilience to be able to cope with that, because it happens and will happen. And there's we hope to be able to sort of raise more awareness through discussions like this, and getting awareness out that can maybe avoid those very worst human tragedies. But you're still going to get distress. It's inevitable, and it's because of the nature of the work that we do. As you said, you've been doing it decades, as you said at the outset. So have I. It's going to happen, and we need to educate our teams and provide them with the support mechanisms, the signposts, and just as we need to do it for directors and individuals that are coping with that. So our R3 is working on those. Part of it was sort of said over conferences and courses is to bring that in. We're working with 3eggs on developing specific training modules. We've got a training academy in R3, which has grown significantly over the last few years, particularly since COVID, because our members came to us and said education's what we really want from body. We want that voice, we want that lobbying, we want the advocacy, and all the rest of it is really important for all the reasons we've discussed. But we also need education and training for all these, including in this area. So members are asking more and more for training in this area, in the soft skills, if you can call it that. I don't think this is a soft skill, it's quite hard skill in that sense. So we are looking at that. The Personal Insolvency Forum. So again, we're working with 3eggs as these are medical health, mental health professionals and scientists that are helping us work skills and training courses of how to identify it, how to cope, some skills and tips for sort of managing that, so that others around you can be empathetic, can be compassionate and aware, and that you can still get on with your job whilst actually having to deal with those. We can't prevent them. And that's something that all medical scientists in this area have been advising R3, and we've been saying at these conferences, is you can't prevent this. Couple of statistics, and this just goes to it. One of the things that this was Louise Newby of 3eggs in November last year. 1 in 4 adults will have a diagnosable mental health condition during their lifetime. I think that that's underestimating it, but as diagnosable mental health. And one of the comments that she said is that for the other 3, they're still going to have mental health issues, because mental health isn't, when you talk about mental health, you can have strong mental health. That is still mental health. You know, you can be in a really strong state of mental health. So, and all of us will go through periods in which you're not 100% on that scale, and at some point you'll be somewhere below it. That is a mental health issue right there, whether it's diagnosable or not. Everybody is going to have to deal with this. Everybody does deal with this, and all firms and organizations are developing these challenges. And R3, its role is, you know, not just to help practitioners be empathetic and compassionate with those that is dealing with, because they are going through something that massively affects their mental health and causes stress and anxiety, but also the stress and anxiety that it causes on their own team for dealing with what is one of the most challenging areas of professional work, in my view. So, yeah, we're developing courses, ensuring that it is on the agenda with training at conferences and courses for those that don't voluntarily sign up to a webinar or an on-demand course or anything like that, and speaking out about it and ensuring that we get the opportunity to come along and talk on forums like this. This is as much a key part of it. This is what is R3 doing, is saying when we're invited and take the opportunity to come and talk on courses, make sure that we do. So it's all part of it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think if you R3 recognise it, members recognise it, we can then recognise it in others. And we spoke about, okay, it shouldn't just be part of a checklist. It's just kind of human instinct. And we are dealing all the time with entrepreneurs that are making the economy what it is. We need to, we need to provide that support, but we need to be of sound mind and body ourselves for that kind of lean, NHS workforce for the business world, as you said. So part of the podcast is tough decisions, and I always ask the guest what's been there. So you don't have to limit it to one. So Tim, what have been your toughest decisions?
Toughest decisions. Well, a tough personal decision was deciding to go from the north of England to work in Scotland. That was a tough decision. Sassenach going into Scottish territory, but I'm pleased to say it's been a decision that's been a tough decision for family and all the rest of it at the time. And those are decisions that sort of stick with you. I think within a working environment, the toughest decisions that I've had to make is when you're the area, putting it frankly, that I find the toughest is when you're dealing with possessions of and evictions for creditors and mortgagees, that part of that inexorable chain of creditor action that ultimately results in some cases in people losing their homes. You touched on it, and that being something that can happen. And as an insolvency practitioner, you come into someone and say, well, I can't tell you that there isn't a risk of that happening. That could be one of the things. And when you see that and you have to make the decision as to, we're in that area now where you have to, you're looking at someone that's going through those sorts of issues. You know that this is going to be an awful impact, and you have to advise your client on that and take an objective and dispassionate view. And it's extremely difficult to do it because you know what the consequences of that are, and you have to give advice on that. That's the part of the area of professional work and legal work that I've been involved with for that period of time. It doesn't make it any easier, and people might think, these are cold, hard people. We're not. Don't enjoy doing those aspects. It's not the everyday aspect of my work, but it happens, and it has happened, and it's really, really tough. You don't enjoy it. You don't come home feeling in any way like you've had a great day. It's quite the opposite. So those are the worst days, when you have to make that decision of, that's the advice that I've got to give, and that's the consequence of it. So yeah, the toughest decisions, I think, for us as professionals is the tough decision to give the advice, knowing the consequences of it.